Hello everyone, and welcome to a new season of Gooey's Dungeon Dive, the podcast where I, Gooey, rank every dungeon in the Legend of Zelda series. And the newest season of Gooey's Dungeon Dive finds us washed ashore a mysterious island, awakening to the sight of a girl who bears a resemblance to a certain princess, and a man who looks like an iconic Italian plumber. The two direct us to the beach, where we are greeted by a mysterious owl, who remarks, "Now I understand why the monsters are starting to act so violently. A courageous lad has come to wake the windfish. It is said you cannot leave the island unless you wake the windfish." The owl then points us in the direction of the mysterious forest to obtain a special key. A strange raccoon seems to have some sort of curse over the forest itself, but by sprinkling some magic powder on its nose, the raccoon is revealed to be none other than our mustachioed plumber lookalike Taran, who seemed to be suffering from some sort of weird mushroom trip. Now with the tail key in hand, the owl tells us we must go explore Tail Cave and retrieve the instrument that lays within, for the windfish waits. So there we have it. We're in Link's Awakening. We're collecting the instruments to wake the windfish so we can leave this island. And we're here at Tail Cave. We're looking now at a different set of dungeons here. We've gone from Super Nintendo and now we're going down to the Game Boy, which is an interesting change of pace. And one thing I love about Link's Awakening right off the bat when we're talking about these specific dungeons is they all kind of take some sort of shape of an object, much like in the original Legend of Zelda. It's kind of a throwback in that sense. In fact, a lot of things in this game we'll see various throwbacks to the original Legend of Zelda, which is pretty cool. Tail Cave itself, of course, takes the shape of a familiar monster who we will see very soon. It's a cool looking map, but it's also the first game in the series to have unique music for every dungeon, so that's cool. It helps them all stick out from each other a little bit more, and we'll see it for the rest of the series for obvious reasons. I've always been a fan of Tail Cave's dungeon. It's nice, it's simple, creepy, like Zelda dungeon tune. Tail Cave itself, I love it. I think it's a fantastic opening dungeon. It does set up pretty much what Link's Awakening dungeons are all about, as opposed to something like A Link to the Past or even Ocarina of Time, whose dungeons kind of slowly ease you into a more complex dungeons by limiting stuff like keys you can get, or like the non-linearity and kind of pacing that out, stretching that out, you know. Tail Cave is actually a lot more open than maybe some of the other intro dungeons of the game. Despite being as open it is, it's still very simple, but obviously it gives you plenty of keys and locked doors and other types of barriers and ways for you to progress. Different people will have totally different experiences playing this. At least there's a couple different ways it can go, you know, compared to something like, I don't know, the Eastern Palace or something like that. Another new interesting distinction in this game itself is some stuff you can collect within the dungeon itself. You have, you know, the map is back, the classic map, but you also have the compass, and the compass is a little different in this. It has a new feature. The compass is a lot more useful in helping you locate chests. You know, it kind of has a pretty novel feature where it makes a little tone when you come into the room that a chest could be found in. It makes that sort of a new, very much more useful tool than I think the compass in previous games, honestly. But there's other more things that stick out in terms of collectibles. The first is the stone beak, which shows up throughout all the dungeons in the game, and they act similar to the telepathic tiles from A Link to the Past, in that they give you a hint, but this time it's like a little beak that you put in an owl statue that gives you a hint. So it's an actual item you have to find, as opposed to like a tile just being placed there you can talk to. They're totally optional for a new player, but they can act as sort of like a key to a barrier of knowledge that you might need to overcome like a puzzle or something like that. So I think using it as a collectible item as opposed to like a freely given hint does make it so you have a slightly more interestingly designed dungeons. So that, could be kind of a unofficial lock, at least a lock in your mind, as opposed to a physical key locking a door. This is one way the game kind of begins to take the series that puts even in a place that puts more emphasis on like puzzles beyond just like navigating the dungeon. But there's another way they do that too. In A Link to the Past, we saw dungeons split up into different sections by using the big key, which would also provide you with the dungeon item in a big chest typically. But in Link's Awakening, that's kind of changed a little bit, because the big key, or the nightmare key in this, it only opens the door to the boss's chamber, but we still see that concept of like the dungeons kind of having distinct parts by actually splitting it up with a dungeon item, which, that's a thing that we've seen a little bit in previous games, and A Link to the Past there was some of that, but this game kind of steps that concept up. And this goes on to be kind of a staple in the Zelda series. It almost becomes like the formula. So this game really helps solidify that for sure. In Tail Cave, for example, there's a few locations that are blocked off by some pits that you can't get over until you get the item Rock's Feather, which it brings the ability to jump to top-down Zelda games, which I think is honestly pretty cool. One of my favorite things to do in this game is to just jump around, and yeah, it's a lot of fun. One of the first locations that you can use this for full effect, actually, is in an underground location that leads to it, and it looks kind of like the underground areas where you get items in like the original Legend of Zelda, so another little throwback there. But this time it's filmed with Goombas, which is totally strange, but that's of course a classic Mario enemy that you're almost tempted to jump on them, and then of course when you get the Rock's Feather you are kind of rewarded in that sense. Now even at this point where you've gotten the Rock's Feather, like there's some non-linearity we have here. You could head over to the path to the boss and take on the mini-boss, but you can't actually go all the way to the boss because you need the nightmare key, so you could have to backtrack and go get that. But, there's a key hole blocking that, so you might have to actually find the other key. And there's only a couple different routes, but I do really appreciate it. The nightmare key, totally here, it illustrates another thing that I love about the dungeons in this game, in that it was designed for the Game Boy. Most of the dungeons take place on a really small screen. It's very similar to the original Legend of Zelda, where you're scrolling just in these blocked screens. But they find interesting ways to take advantage of the limited technology they're working on to make these dungeons feel more big and cohesive, even though they feel very small. It's pretty minor here, but you can see the nightmare key from one spot where there's a pit, and then it's on this higher level, and it looks really cool. But you can't actually access it from there, and you have to work your way around. It just makes the dungeons feel a little bit more complex, and there's going to be a little bit more puzzles and stuff like that using this concept. So pretty cool. We also take the concept of the mini boss to new heights in the series. I liked the old Legend of Zelda bosses coming back, for example, but I think this is even cooler with these unique, distinct mini bosses. The mini boss of Tail Cave is this guy Rolling Bones, who's this weird little gross pink monster. And he rolls this spike bar right at you, and you have to use the newly obtained Rock's Feather to jump over it and attack him. It's pretty simple, but it's pretty effective, and I think it's really fun, especially for a first-time player. It's a good intro mini-boss. This room is only a couple rooms away from the actual boss room. The mini-boss room is very close to the boss room. But again, with the slight openness of this dungeon, you could encounter this a little bit earlier and not have the nightmare key, so you got a little bit more, stuff to uncover and come back to progress. It's also useful because there's some nice little warp checkpoints that are left behind from the mini-boss. So that's, that'll come into play too in terms of what we were talking about, splitting the dungeons up into sections. That will become a key factor as these checkpoints that you can return to from the beginning of the dungeon. We finally make it to the Nightmare Chamber, and we discover a familiar foe in the Moldorm, he buzzes at us, he calls us an outsider, and then he starts spinning around. He's very similar to his Link to the Past counterpart. He's, this big worm guy that you gotta hit him on the tail. Pretty straightforward. There's some pits that, you can fall in that you want to avoid, obviously. It's a little bit easier in the Switch remake. There's less pits and so you generally have a little bit more wiggle room, but I think it's appropriate. But either way, when you fall down, it kind of puts you in this underground passage that leads right back up to the room before its chamber. And so the backtracking in it, compared to like Moldorm and A Link to the Past, it's not so bad. You can fall down, and then if you can just go right back up. You don't have to go multiple rooms. And if you die, you can warp from the beginning right to that mini boss room, and you're only a couple rooms away. So it's not so bad. Not so bad backtracking to restart this fight, which is pretty simple. Again, simple but effective fight. Another small detail that I like is also in this little underground chamber. There's like corpses or skeletons hanging from the ceiling, which is like nice and pretty creepy in this sort of lighthearted game. In another scene kind of reminiscent of the original Legend of Zelda, you defeat the boss, and instead of like in A Link to the Past where the treasure's right there and you leave, you kind of go into this special little extra room, this extra chamber that contains the special item you're trying to get. But they make it a little bit more interesting, I think. Unlike Legend of Zelda, where you're collecting just like these triangles, these shards of the Triforce, there's actually the instrument that the owl spoke of. It is the full moon cello. And I love this. You pick it up, it plays this haunting little melody, a bright light engulfs the room, and we just get this little message that says, "Swamp. A path opens in the blooms." I love it. It's so simple, poetic, beautiful. That describes basically everything about this game to me. But right now, we gotta rank Tail Cave. So again, I think Tail Cave is a great first dungeon. I kind of made the reference, like in Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past, you kind of have a more extended introductory process to the game. Like in A Link to the Past, you sort of have Hyrule Castle, which I think is a fantastic intro, but it's just that first part of it isn't like a full dungeon. But then your like first real full dungeon in the game is Eastern Palace, and even then it's not as complex as like this. It's a little bit longer, but it's a little bit more straightforward. They're both great introductions, but I kind of consider the introductory process of the game longer, like I was saying, but in a good way. That being said, I think I've made a reference to it before, but Link's Awakening is one of my favorite styles of dungeon. I love the design philosophy behind the dungeons of this game. I just love the little intricacies. In this dungeon, for example, you can be holding like 3 keys before you spend them anywhere, and you have multiple places you can spend them too. So it's a little bit open, but again, it's also very simple. Like, don't think I'm trying to say this is like super crazy complex or anything. I like it more than like the Eastern Palace, for example. Let's just say that. Though, I would say it's gotta actually land somewhere between Eastern Palace and like below Hyrule Castle. Hyrule Castle and above is like my top tier A Link to the Past dungeons. And I don't think Tail Cave totally gets there. I think it's just it's a fine starter intro dungeon, so it's not like crazy amazing or anything. But I do think it's kind of better than a lot of the dungeons I have below it, which I have a bit more. There's things I don't necessarily like about them. So, for example, all of the Light World dungeons are pretty good. But I do personally just enjoy Tail Cave more than them. And then when I'm looking at A Link to the Past dungeons, I look at Thieves Town, Ice Palace, and Turtle Rock, and they're all dungeons that they all have things I really, really do love, but there's aspects of them too that I'm kind of indifferent or negative about. Whereas like Tail Cave, I just think of as solid. Like it's not, it's not mind-bending or anything, but it is just like a solid dungeon. So I'm gonna put it below Hyrule Castle, but I am gonna put it above Turtle Rock. So it's gonna slip right into number 7 on my list, which, it's saying a lot, but we'll see where it goes. I think, there's probably gonna be some dungeons I like worse than it, some I like better. But the pacing of Link's Awakening is overall very good. So I think I might even have some that are... It'll remind me a little bit of Adventure of Link, where they're all kind of similar in certain aspects, but the progression is just so good so that it feels natural. And then later in the game, I think there's some standouts that'll really shoot up to the top of my list. So, but I think for now, right in the middle of the A Link to the Past dungeons perfectly describes Tail Cave, a dungeon I personally do have a lot of affinity for. Probably one of the first dungeons in Zelda I ever completed, honestly. So, perfect spot for it, I think. Thanks to everyone for watching, and I will see you next week for Bottle Grotto.